I wanted to like 7 Days to Die, but in the first 10 hours, I didn't. Slow progression, overwhelming systems, and the dated presentation almost lost me. This review breaks down what finally made it click, where it struggles, and whether 7 Days to Die is worth playing in 2026. Today I'm taking a grounded look at 7 Days to Die, developed by the Fun Pimps. This review is based on my time playing solo on PC via Steam, with a solid number of hours invested primarily into exploration and progression. All gameplay was done via vanilla settings, no altered stat drain, no custom difficulty tweaks, and no mods. What you're hearing here reflects the game exactly as it's presented out of the box. My goal with this review is straightforward, to evaluate whether 7 Days to Die holds up in 2026 as a compelling zombie craft survival experience, and whether it's genuinely worth diving into today. That question feels especially relevant given the controversy surrounding the last major update. Many of those changes have since been walked back, with version 2.5 releasing towards the end of 2025, making this a meaningful moment to reassess the game in its current state, rather than through the lens of past backlash. For context, 7 Days to Die drops you into Navasgame County, Arizona, a brutally unforgiving post-apocalyptic landscape overrun by the undead. Structurally, it's an open-world survival game that blends first-person combat, survival horror, tense tower defense, and RPG progression. You're expected to scavenge, craft, loot, mine, explore, build, and develop your character, all while preparing for increasingly punishing threats that escalate over time. You know, on the 7th day. With that in mind, this review focused specifically on how the game performs as a solo zombie craft survival experience. The emphasis here is on systems, pacing, and long-term viability when you're surviving alone. At its core, 7 Days to Die operates on a familiar craft survival loop. Loot, craft, survive, improve, and repeat. That said, I want to be transparent about how long it took for the loop to click for me. My first impressions were not strong. Going in, I'd heard a lot of positivity around the game, but within the first 10 hours, it simply hadn't landed for me. Visually, it felt dated. Mechanically, it came across as clunky. Progression systems didn't immediately feel meaningful, and even on default vanilla settings, the loop felt slow to get moving. At that stage, I wasn't particularly invested in what I was building towards. That perception shifted noticeably once I reached my first Blood Moon, experiencing that pressure point where preparation, base design, and combat suddenly mattered, helped contextualize everything I'd done up until that point. From there, the gameplay loop began to make sense. As more crafting options unlocked, the act of gathering materials and improving gear started to feel rewarding rather than routine, and the enjoyment steadily grew as the systems revealed their purpose. Structurally, the loop follows what most players will recognize from the genre. You explore a biome, grind materials, craft better tools and gear, then push outwards into more dangerous territory once you're equipped to survive it. Where 7 Days to Die differs is how that progression is framed. Instead of traditional end-of-biome bosses like you find in Valheim, progression is largely driven by trader missions and higher-tier challenges. Completing these tasks unlocks access to harsher biomes and the means to survive within them. Biome exploration is the backbone of progression. There are 5 biomes in total, 4 of which introduce environmental hazards that will kill you if you're unprepared. For example, crafting items like the Black Lung Serum allows you to survive longer in the burnt forest, roughly 5 additional minutes, giving you a window to explore and complete objectives. These timers can be reset by entering buildings with sufficient cover, meaning the serum isn't always mandatory, but it dramatically reduces survival anxiety when pushing deeper into hostile zones. This pattern repeats across biomes. Unlock survival tools, explore further, complete challenges, and expand your reach. As progression continues, you also unlock vehicle parts, which significantly changes how the loop feels. Vehicles don't just speed up traversal across biomes, they also provide extra storage, which directly feed back into longer expeditions, more efficient looting, and less backtracking. At that point, the loop becomes less about short survival bursts, and more about sustained exploration and logistical planning. Where the system becomes more diversive is a heavy reliance on challenges and quests for progression. On one hand, that structure gives the game direction and momentum. On the other, it limits that kind of self-directed narrative that many craft survival fans enjoy. In games like Green Hell, crafting feels secondary to survival and story. In Valheim, at least the last time I played it, progression was driven almost entirely by exploration, rather than explicit objectives. 7 Days to Die sits firmly on the opposite end of the spectrum. Initially, I wasn't sold on this approach. The quest structure felt restrictive, almost at odds with the creative freedom typically associated with this genre. But over time, I came to appreciate what it adds. These quests do provide purpose, and more importantly, they actively push you forward into the next biome. Once I accepted this is where the progression lives, the loop becomes far more engaging, and that's where the enjoyment really settled in. The Blood Moon, which cycles every 7 days, is a great feature to prevent stagnation. Without it, enjoyment could easily flatten out. That looming deadline forces you to stop exploring, reassess your situation, and either return to the existing settlement or construct a purpose-built horde base. That shift from exploration to defense injects urgency into the loop and gives each game week a clear rhythm. The tension leading into day 7 and the scramble to prepare for it becomes a defining part of the experience. The gameplay loop is a combination of biome gating, quest-driven progression, and Blood Moon pressure that keeps the core gameplay loop moving forward once it finally finds its footing. From a combat perspective, 7 Days to Die largely delivers what you'd expect from a zombie survival game, but with enough mechanical depth to keep encounters tense as systems begin to overlap. In terms of enemy variation, there are 30 plus zombie variants, each with differing health pools, damage outputs, and damage mitigation. Visually, the designs are strong and thematically consistent. The zombie designs are what you'd expect to find in a decaying, post-apocalyptic world. Alongside standard humanoid zombies, there are also zombified animals, which adds spikes of unpredictability during exploration. I haven't personally encountered the zombie bear yet, but I have seen clips of them in action, and that clearly sits at the top end of intimidation scale, and reinforces the idea that some threats are meant to be avoided, rather than fought head-on. Zombie behaviour sits in an interesting space between predictability and chaos. On the surface, the AI follows a clear rule set. Zombies generally take the shortest path. However, that doesn't mean encounters feel entirely brainless. During my first Blood Moon, I'd set a trap at the entrance of my base expecting the zombie horde to funnel through it. Instead, they opted to smash through a wall, which at the time felt like a flash of intelligence from what is ostensibly rotting flesh. In reality, it was likely just the AI calculating to break through that wall was faster than navigating my setup. But that distinction doesn't really matter in the moment. The result was tension and surprise, which is what the system is aiming for. Once you start to understand the limitations of the zombies, the cracks do show. Zombies can only jump one block at a time, which makes it relatively easy to design defensive structures that exploit that restriction. During my second Blood Moon, I took over a fire station that only had 2 access points to the first floor, or second floor for our US friends. By removing those routes, I was able to funnel the horde for a single choke point filled with traps. At that stage, combat becomes more about presentation and knowledge than reaction speed. Blood Moons also have a known constraint by default. Only 8 zombies can be active at once, which makes planning far more manageable. That said, those settings can be pushed all the way up to 64 concurrent zombies, and at that point, the balance shifts dramatically. In terms of combat feel, I've primarily focused on melee combat with spears, investing little to no points in firearms or other melee weapons. So far, melee feedback and hit registration feels solid. Attacks land with clarity, and there's a tangible sense of impact, especially when those heads explode or limbs go flying off. That physical feedback goes a long way of keeping close quarters combat engaging rather than frustrating. Gunplay by comparison feels serviceable. It's not doing anything particularly groundbreaking, but it doesn't feel worse than other FPS survival titles either. One combat mechanic I particularly like is how reload times and movement penalties are handled early on. Before investing points into the agility skill tree, specifically perks like run and gun, reloading stops you sprinting away. That makes every shot a calculated decision, especially knowing that firing an unsilenced weapon will attract more zombies. Early game, this pushes you towards melee combat and forces you to weigh short-term safety against long-term consequences, which fits the survival tone well. Difficulty scaling ties directly into the game's game stage system. As you level up, the game responds by increasing the frequency of feral and irradiated zombies, both of which have higher health pools and deal significantly more damage. At higher stages, you'll also start to see demolishers, enemies capable of detonating themselves if you hit the right trigger points, often resulting in massive structural damage and a rapid collapse of poorly designed bases. Importantly, this escalation is partially offset by your own progression. Better gear, stronger weapons, and improved perks help mitigate the rising difficulty. When balanced correctly, it creates a steady arms race rather than a sudden difficulty cliff. Overall, combat in 7 Days to Die rewards knowledge, preparation, and system mastery more than raw mechanical skill. Once you understand how zombies move, how structures behave, and how scaling works, the game becomes less about chaos and more about controlled survival, though the Blood Moon ensures that control is always temporary. When it comes to long-term engagement, 7 Days to Die places a heavy emphasis on layered systems, but those systems don't reveal themselves evenly. One of the biggest frustration points for me is the early game crafting experience, which, compared to other craft survival titles, feels far more punishing than it needs to be. In many games within the genre, the opening hours offer steady, visible progression even when you're inexperienced. Here, the beginning feels like an extended grind just to get moving. Progression is slow, feedback is limited, and without prior knowledge of where and how to loot efficiently, it can feel directionless. That said, once you begin to understand the loot tables and where specific resources are likely to spawn, that pace does improve noticeably, and crafting starts to feel more purposeful. Crafting depth itself is substantial, but often borders on unnecessary complexity. Particularly early on, the systems are deep rather than elegant, and until you internalize how they interlink, it's easy to feel like you're working against the system rather than with it. Once that mental model clicks, however, the experience becomes smooth and far more engaging. Base building is an area where expectations from other craft survivals may not align fully with 7 Days to Die. I generally enjoy base building. It's something I've happily sunk hours into Valheim, but here, it hasn't fully clicked for me yet. Instead of designing and building from scratch, I found myself repurposing existing structures for survival. For example, after discovering the fire station ahead of my second blood moon, I seriously considered relocating my original base. What becomes clear fairly quickly is that 7 Days to Die subtly encourages a split base philosophy. Many experienced players and creators I've been watching build a dedicated Blood Moon horde base, often a freestanding, purpose-built structure designed to funnel zombies efficiently, while keeping their crafting and storage base separate. That approach makes a lot more sense mechanically. My first base suffered visible damage during the first horde night, leaving holes that reinforce the idea that defending everything in one place isn't always optimal. Base building here is less about creativity for creativity's sake and more about engineering for survival, which may or may not appeal depending on what you want from the genre. Progression pacing is where the game becomes more divisive. On paper, the progression system is deep and flexible. You gain experience through standard actions like killing zombies, completing quests, and interacting with the world, which feeds into an overall level. Each level grants skill points which can be invested into 5 main attribute trees, each with up to 10 points, unlocking the ability to invest points into a wide range of perks. There are also general perks layered on top of this, adding further complexity. Where progression slows dramatically is through the learn by reading system. Most crafting recipes are locked behind magazines, requiring you to collect and read a specific number to unlock each tier. There are 23 magazine categories, some of which go all the way to level 100. If you're not fully aware of how critical this system is early on, it can completely stall progression. And that was my experience. I didn't initially understand the spawn logic for magazines, and as a result, I hit a wall. Most notably, I couldn't craft the workbench. Without it, my progression into the burnt forest biome was effectively halted. And after quite a few hours, that became a genuine source of frustration. There are also additional book series that function differently, requiring you to collect specific volumes to unlock bonuses or perks. While this adds depth, it also compounds the grind. Certain perks can mitigate this. For example, Intellect Mastery can increase your chance of finding magazines by 25%, or even grant a 50% chance to double your points while reading. But that solution still requires you to engage with the very system that's slowing you down. My initial impression of the perk system as a whole is that it's overwhelming. There are layers of menus, stats, and sub-menus. I'm also not a fan of tying core crafting progression so heavily to randomized magazine drops. While it does encourage exploration, something I normally enjoy in games like DayZ or RPGs such as Fallout, here it feels forced rather than organic. Being compelled to loot in order to unlock basic craft functionality removes player agency. And in my case, it actively reduced my desire to engage with those systems. In terms of resource scarcity, the game is much more balanced. Each biome feels appropriately tuned in terms of what it has to offer and what it withholds. You're rarely starved of basic materials, and the escalation between biome feels logical. The main source of friction isn't raw resources, but progression items, particularly magazines. Once you understand where to look, that grind does ease, but the early hours do little to communicate that knowledge, which impacts long-term engagement more than it should. Taken as a whole, 7 Days to Die offers deep crafting and progression systems, but they demand patience, learning, and a tolerance for friction, especially from the start. For players willing to push past that initial wall, there is a rewarding ecosystem underneath. For others, that early grind may be enough to push them away before the game ever finds its stride. When you strip away the themes and aesthetics, 7 Days to Die is ultimately held together by its survival mechanics. And this is an area where the game is largely effective. Core stat drains, hunger, thirst, and stamina are all consistently relevant and well integrated into moment-to-moment decision-making. Early on, especially, it feels like you're constantly on the back foot. Food and clean water are limited, stamina management dictates how aggressively you can fight or flee, and mistakes compound quickly. As a result, death in the early game is common, and in many cases, expected. Beyond raw stat management, the game layers in injuries and status effects that add depth to the survival. Environmental hazards and zombie encounters can leave you with sprains, broken bones, or infection. I particularly like the infection system. Being bitten by a zombie or attacked by an animal carries a genuine risk, which adds a weight to avoiding damage, rather than simply trading hits. That subtle shift encourages more deliberate combat and reinforces the idea that survival isn't just about killing enemies efficiently, it's about minimizing harm altogether. In terms of punishment, 7 Days to Die takes a relatively forgiving approach, at least on the vanilla settings. You will die a lot, but the consequences don't always feel severe enough to deter risky behaviour. In my case, I admittedly cheese several deaths to reset stats or remove ailments, which undercuts the intended tension. The penalty system doesn't rely on a permanent stat loss or gear deletion. Instead, death applies an experience debt, which must be paid back by earning XP before normal progression resumes. This is a different philosophy compared to something like Valheim, where death results in immediate stat drain and a more tangible sense of loss. That said, the framework is flexible. For players looking for harsher consequences, higher difficulties and permadeath modes exist, and those fundamentally change how survival decisions are made. On default settings, however, death feels like more of a setback than a failure, which lowers the emotional stakes unless you self-impose restrictions. Recovery loops are where the system shows its accessibility. On vanilla settings, it's generally easy to bounce back. You can retrieve your gear, manage your debuffs, and get back into the loop without too much trouble. This makes the game approachable for solo players and newcomers. It also ensures a single mistake doesn't derail hours of progression. At the same time, that safety net is optional. Players who want survival to feel more oppressive can tune the experience towards higher risk or permadeath. Overall, 7 Days to Die separates survival mechanics from its survival themes quite effectively. The systems are robust and interconnected, but the severity of consequences is largely player defined. On default settings, survival feels demanding but forgiving, a balance that supports long-term play, even if occasionally blunts the tension that the world is trying to convey. 7 Days to Die delivers a mixed but generally functional presentation. My playthrough was done on the original Navezgane map with completely vanilla settings. Whilst the game does support random generation for some biomes, sticking to the default map provides a clear baseline for how the developers intended the experience to be structured. In terms of map design and flow, Navezgane is solid. Each biome feels distinct in both layout and tone, and the world consistently communicates that you're moving through a collapsed post-apocalyptic wasteland. The transitions between biome make sense mechanically and visually, reinforcing progression rather than disorientating the player. Some environmental visuals are undeniably basic, but they largely do their job. Where the game really stands out visually is the building design. Some points of interest, from industrial sites to public buildings, are well constructed, readable, and often memorable. These spaces do a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to environmental storytelling and exploration flow. When it comes to visual readability during combat and looting, which isn't an area I weigh heavily for my reviews. For me, I value gameplay systems and audio feedback far more than graphic fidelity. 7 Days to Die lands squarely in the serviceable category. The visuals are functional but unremarkable. They don't meaningfully enhance immersion, but they don't actively harm it. Enemy animations, particularly death animations, can occasionally look awkward or unintentionally comedic, sometimes to the point where they feel almost suspect. That said, readability during combat is generally clear enough to avoid frustration, even if it lacks polish. The sound design is where immersion both strengthens and weakens. The overall audioscape is competent, with certain elements doing exactly what they need to do, without ever fully standing out. Atmospheric audio in particular is effective. Ambient sounds create a constant sense of unease, subtly suggesting that danger could be nearby, or that something is about to go wrong. That low-level tension supports exploration well and reinforces the survival tone. Zombie sound effects, however, are far less consistent. Many of the sound bites feel low quality and can peak unexpectedly, which is a strange design choice in a game which could really utilize audio to drive tension. I've also noticed instances where zombie audio continues playing after the enemy has died, which can be generally misleading. In those moments, you're left second-guessing whether the threat is still present, not because of an intentional tension, but because of unclear feedback. Music is another uneven element. Some tracks work well in the background, but repetition becomes a real issue over longer sessions. The Blood Moon music in particular starts strong, but quickly wears thin. By the time you survive the event, the track can feel irritating rather than intense, creating audio fatigue instead of sustained tension. It would work far better if it simply signaled the start of the event before fading into the background. There are other, more subtle ways to maintain pressure during a horde fight, and here the music overstays its welcome. Taken together, the audio and visual presentation of 7 Days to Die is functional rather than immersive. The atmosphere created in this game is weak, and the highlights are the environmental design and ambient sound. But the graphical fidelity and musical composition in places let it down. It supports a gameplay loop without elevating it, which leaves room for refinement. After spending a solid amount of time in 7 Days to Die, I'm landing on a 3 out of 5. There's nothing here that I would call outright bad, but there's also very little that genuinely made me stop and go, wow. The visuals, audio, and overall map design are serviceable across the board. They do what they need to do, but they rarely elevate the experience. The atmospheric audio is genuinely strong and does a good job of maintaining tension during the exploration, but that strength is undercut by the Blood Moon music, which not only is extremely loud, but also becomes repetitive to the point of audio fatigue by the end of the event. The crafting systems are enjoyable once you unlock what you need to, and there's a real satisfaction in reaching that point. However, the combination of the learn by reading system alongside a traditional perk and leveling system feels way too much. Individually, both systems make sense. Together, they create unnecessary friction, especially for new players. The early hours don't do enough to communicate how critical magazines and trader quests are to progression. And until you understand that, the game can feel slow, confusing, and overly restrictive. That said, once those key pieces started to fall in place for me, the game began to click. Progression started to feel intentional, the gameplay loop tightened up, and I found myself enjoying the experience far more than I did in the opening hours. Whether the quest-driven structure works for you will likely come down to personal preference. If you enjoy systems actively pushing you forward, it adds direction and purpose. If you prefer total freedom and self-driven progression, it will easily become a deal breaker. So here we are, the end of the 7th day, and we survived. If you're a veteran to 7 Days to Die, I generally love to hear how many hours you've put in, and how you feel about the current state of the game compared to earlier versions. What works for you, what doesn't, and what would you like to see changed going forward? I'll also be continuing to play 7 Days to Die live on stream, so if you want to come say hi, I'm live every Tuesday and Thursday evenings. And if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up, consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!